The sun was a warm, possessive hand on Karen's shoulders. She floated on her back, eyes closed, a beatific smile plastered on her face. The turquoise water of the Oakwood residence's community pool cradled her, muffling the grating sounds of the outside world, the squeal of a toddler, the incessant drone of a lawnmower, the very existence of people who didn't understand personal space. This was her sanctuary. She paid a small fortune in HOA fees for this manufactured piece, and she intended to soak up every last drop. Her phone, safely ensconced in a waterproof pouch on the edge of the pool, buzzed. Without opening her eyes, she lifted a perfectly manicured hand and tapped the speakerphone icon. "Deborah, you won't believe it," Karen said, her voice echoing slightly across the water. They finally fixed the filtration system. "The water is almost tolerable today." Deborah's tinny voice crackled through the speaker. "Did you talk to the board about the recycling bins again? People are just throwing everything in there. I saw a pizza box yesterday." "A whole pizza box, Karen?" "I'm handling it," Karen sighed, a martyr for the cause of suburban order. "But first I have to deal with the noise pollution." She cracked one eye open, her gaze zeroing in on a young mother trying to coax her hesitant 3-year-old into the shallow end. The child was splashing, a crime of the highest order. Some people think community pool means it's a free-for-all daycare. She paddled languidly to the side, her movements sleek and proprietary, as if she were the queen of this chlorinated kingdom. She didn't get out. She didn't need to. Her voice was an instrument of command, honed over years of customer service complaints and parent-teacher conferences. "Excuse me," she called out, her tone dripping with false sweetness. The young mother looked up, startled. "Could you possibly keep it down? Some of us are trying to de-stress." The mother, a tired-looking woman in her late 20s, clutched her child's hand. "He's just excited." "We won't be long." "That's what they all say," Karen muttered before turning her attention back to her phone call. She didn't notice the old man sitting under the shade of a large umbrella 20 feet away. She never noticed him. He was part of the scenery, as inanimate as the plastic lounge chairs or the faded pool rules sign he sat beside. His name was Arthur Pendleton, and he was reading a dog-eared copy of a Cold War spy novel. He'd lived at Oakwood for 15 years, long before the complex was overrun with young families and self-important middle-aged women like Karen. He came to the pool every day, not to swim, but to read. It was the only place he could find a sliver of quiet that wasn't the suffocating silence of his own apartment. But lately, the quiet had been replaced by Karen, by her loud phone calls, her public shaming of other residents, her incessant, grating complaints about everything from the temperature of the water to the unacceptable brand of complimentary sunscreen in the women's locker room. Arthur turned a page, his knuckles white. He could feel a familiar pressure building behind his eyes. He'd seen her berate the teenage lifeguard for not skimming with enthusiasm. He'd watched her tell a group of friends they had to leave because their laughter was disruptive to the ambiance. Every day was a new performance, and he was the unwilling audience. Today she seemed particularly emboldened. After ending her call with Deborah, she set her sights on a new target. A group of teenagers tossing a foam football in the deep end. "Do you see the sign?" Karen shouted, pointing a dripping finger. "It explicitly says no horseplay. Is reading that difficult for your generation?" One of the boys, a lanky kid with a shock of red hair, caught the football. "We're just having fun." "Your idea of fun is my liability," she snapped. "One of you slips, cracks your head open, and suddenly our HOA fees are skyrocketing. Go to a public park if you want to behave like animals?" The boys exchanged annoyed glances, but the joy was gone from their game. They tossed the ball out of the pool and retreated to the far side, whispering among themselves. Karen smiled, a smug, triumphant twist of her lips. She had restored order. Arthur closed his book with a soft snap. The sound was lost in the ambient noise, but for him, it was a decision. He'd spent a lifetime following rules, deferring, letting things slide. He had followed orders in places that made this sterile, manicured courtyard look like a fever dream. He had watched men with real power and real grievances, and he had learned the delicate art of calculated response. But he was old now. His patience, once a deep and placid lake, had become a shallow, sun-baked puddle, and Karen was dancing on the cracks. He stood up, his joints protesting with a quiet groan. He was a tall man, stooped by age but with a frame that still held a ghost of its former strength. He walked past Karen, who was now adjusting the straps of her swimsuit, and didn't give her a second glance. He headed towards the community grilling area, a small patio with 2 stainless steel barbecues and a set of picnic tables. Each grill was hooked up to a standard 20-pound propane cylinder tucked neatly into the base. Arthur knelt, his movements methodical and sure. His hands, though wrinkled and spotted with age, were steady as he unscrewed the regulator hose. He tested the weight of the tank. It felt about half full. Plenty. He straightened up, holding the gray cylinder in both hands. It was heavier than he expected, but adrenaline was a potent fuel. He turned and walked back towards the pool. The teenage lifeguard, a college kid named Ben, who was more interested in his phone than the swimmers, finally looked up. "Sir, you can't bring that over here." Arthur ignored him. He walked directly to the edge of the pool, his shadow falling over Karen as she floated, her eyes once again closed in blissful ignorance. The young mother saw him first. She let out a small, sharp gasp and pulled her child out of the water. The teenagers stopped whispering and stared, their mouths agape. The atmosphere shifted in an instant. The lazy afternoon heat was suddenly charged with a strange electric tension. Karen felt the change. She felt the sudden silence, the collective intake of breath. She opened her eyes. The first thing she saw was the old man, standing over her like the Grim Reaper. The second thing she saw was the gas cylinder in his hands. Her brain couldn't process it. It was too absurd, too out of place in her carefully curated world. "What do you think you're doing?" she demanded, her voice more irritated than afraid. "That's a safety violation." Arthur's eyes met hers. They were pale blue, washed out by the sun, but in their depths was an intensity that startled her. It was a look of profound, bottomless exhaustion. He looked like a man who had finally reached the end of a very, very long road. He didn't say a word. With a grunt of effort, he swung the gas cylinder forward and simply let go. It arced through the air for a brief moment, a gray harbinger against the brilliant blue sky, before it crashed into the water less than 2 feet from her face. The splash was enormous, a cold, chlorinated wave that slapped her across the mouth. The tank bobbed to the surface, its nozzle sputtering, releasing a stream of bubbles that broke the surface with an audible, sinister hiss. For a heartbeat, no one moved. The scene was frozen, the horrified mother, the stunned teenagers, the lifeguard halfway out of his chair, and Karen, treading water, staring at the hissing canister that smelled faintly of rotten eggs. Then, chaos erupted. A woman screamed. People scrambled out of the pool, slipping on wet concrete, grabbing for children and towels. "He's crazy," someone yelled. "It's going to explode." Karen's self-preservation instinct finally kicked in. She thrashed her way to the side of the pool, hauling herself out with a graceless heave. She stood there, dripping and trembling, not from cold, but from a rage so pure it felt like a physical blow. She whipped her head around, her eyes wild, searching for him. Arthur hadn't moved. He stood by the edge of the pool, watching the cylinder bob in the water, a strange, detached expression on his face. He looked almost satisfied. Ben, the lifeguard, was on his phone, his voice shaking. "Yes, Oakwood Residences. Someone threw a gas tank in the pool. I need the police." "And the fire department." "I don't know." Karen stormed towards Arthur, her finger jabbing the air. You maniac! You tried to kill me! You tried to blow us all up!" Arthur finally turned his gaze from the pool to her. His voice, when he spoke, was unnervingly calm, a quiet rasp that cut through the panic. "Did I?" Sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer with alarming speed. 2 police cars and a fire engine screamed into the complex's parking lot. Residents began pouring out of their apartments, drawn by the commotion. Within minutes, the pool area was swarming with uniforms. Firefighters cautiously approached the pool, assessing the hissing cylinder. Police officers were trying to control the scene, their voices sharp and authoritative. "I want him arrested!" Karen shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at Arthur, who now stood with his hands clasped loosely behind his back. "He's a terrorist! He threw a bomb in the pool!" A stern-faced police sergeant approached Arthur. "Sir, I need you to come with me." Arthur nodded slowly, offering no resistance as the sergeant took his arm. A younger officer came forward with handcuffs. As the metal clicked around his wrinkled wrists, the sergeant leaned in, getting a better look at the old man's face. His own expression flickered from professional stoicism to disbelief. "Wait a minute," the sergeant said, his voice dropping low. "I know you." He stared at the old man, a forgotten memory clicking into play. The crowd of residents parted like a nervous sea as Sergeant Frank Miller led Arthur Pendleton towards the squad car. The old man walked with a slow, deliberate shuffle, his cuffed hands held awkwardly behind his back, his expression as placid as if he were on a Sunday stroll. He didn't look at the whispering neighbors or the flashing lights. His gaze was fixed on some distant, invisible point. Karen, wrapped in a ridiculously undersized towel provided by a paramedic, was not going to be ignored. She trailed them, a furious, dripping comet of indignation. "Is that it?" she demanded, her voice shrill enough to cut through the din. "You're just going to walk him away? He should be in leg irons. He tried to assassinate me." Miller stopped and turned, his face a granite mask of professionalism, but his eyes were weary. "Ma'am, an officer will take your full statement." "Please let us do our jobs. Your job is to protect citizens like me from psychopaths like him." She jabbed a finger at Arthur, who didn't even flinch. "I want him charged with attempted murder." "Terrorism! I want his picture on the news. I want everyone to see what he did." "We'll take that under advisement," Miller said, his tone flat. He opened the back door of the squad car and gently guided Arthur inside. The old man folded himself into the seat without a word of protest. As Miller closed the door, his eyes met Karen's one last time. He saw a woman who wasn't just angry or scared. She was ecstatic. She was the star of a drama she had been waiting her whole life to direct. The drive to the station was suffocatingly quiet. Miller watched Arthur in the rearview mirror. The old man's reflection was still, his pale blue eyes staring out the window at the passing blur of manicured lawns and identical townhouses. The silence was more unnerving than any screaming rant. "You want to tell me what that was about, Arthur?" Miller finally asked, keeping his voice even. Arthur didn't turn his head. "She was disturbing the peace." Miller let out a short, incredulous laugh. "She was disturbing the peace? So you threw a 20-pound propane tank at her head?" "I didn't throw it at her head," Arthur corrected him softly. "I threw it near her." "There's a difference. A difference a DA isn't going to care much about. They evacuated 3 buildings, Arthur. The bomb squad is on their way to fish that thing out of the pool. Do you have any idea the panic you caused?" "Panic is loud," Arthur said, a strange lucidity in his voice. "But it's honest. It's better than the noise she makes." Miller gripped the steering wheel, his knuckles turning white. This was wrong, all of it. The man in his back seat wasn't the man he remembered. The Arthur Pendleton he knew was a pillar of quiet strength, a man who diffused chaos, not created it. He pulled into the station's secure sally port. The garage door rumbling shut behind them, sealing them in a concrete box. Meanwhile, Karen had arrived at the station in a separate car. Having refused medical treatment on the grounds that her emotional trauma was far more severe than any physical scrape. She swept into the lobby like a conquering hero, demanding to speak to the highest-ranking officer available. She was eventually guided into a small, sterile interview room by a young, tired-looking detective named Chen. "I'll need you to start from the beginning, Ms." Chen began, pulling out a notepad. "It's Thompson. Karen Thompson," she said, her voice trembling with practiced fragility. "And I'm not sure I can. It was like something out of a movie. A horror movie." She dabbed at her dry eyes with a tissue. "One minute I was enjoying a rare moment of peace. The next, this monster, this complete stranger, was standing over me with a bomb." "A bomb?" Detective Chen repeated, his pen hovering over the paper. "The firefighters confirmed it was a standard propane cylinder, ma'am. The kind for a barbecue. He meant for it to be a bomb," Karen insisted, leaning forward. "He was trying to ignite the water. The chlorine, the chemicals. He was trying to create a fireball." He looked me right in the eye. "It was pure evil. I've never been so terrified in my entire life." She spent the next 45 minutes weaving a narrative of premeditated malice. Arthur hadn't just been sitting there. He'd been stalking her, watching her every move. He hadn't just walked to the grill. He had marched with lethal intent. She was a pillar of the community, a concerned citizen, and he was a dangerous radical who had targeted her for reasons she couldn't possibly fathom. She was the victim of a hate crime, a targeted attack, an act of domestic terrorism. By the time she was finished, Detective Chen's notepad was filled with frantic scribbles. That would be nearly impossible to reconcile with the half-dozen other witnesses. Statements that described Arthur as a quiet old man and Karen as a relentless pest. Back in the booking area, Arthur was processed with quiet compliance. He submitted to being fingerprinted and having his mugshot taken, his expression unchanging. Sergeant Miller had pulled him out of the main holding cell and put him in a vacant interrogation room, a small kindness that was a flagrant breach of protocol. He brought the old man a cup of water. "I'm trying to help you here, Arthur," Miller said, sitting across the small metal table from him. "But you're giving me nothing. Reckless endangerment, assault, inducing panic. They're going to throw the book at you unless you give me something to work with. A reason. Anything." Arthur took a slow sip of water. "The valve was open, Frank." Miller frowned. "What?" "The valve on the cylinder," Arthur clarified. "I opened it before I picked it up." "All the way." Miller stared at him, the blood draining from his face as the implication hit him. "A propane tank won't explode if you throw it in a pool. It's just a sealed metal container, but an open tank, venting flammable gas into the water. That was a different story. It was still a 1,000,000-to-1 shot that anything would happen, but the intent, the sheer technical knowledge of it. "Why are you telling me that?" Miller whispered, his voice hoarse. "Because you asked for a reason," Arthur said. He looked down at his own hands, resting on the table. "And because you should know who you're dealing with." A cold dread washed over Miller. He left the room, closing the door behind him, and walked on unsteady legs to his office. He needed to see the file. He needed to see the official record, to connect the man he remembered to the man in that room. He logged into the state and federal database, his fingers flying across the keyboard. He typed in the name, Pendleton, Arthur J. The file that appeared on his screen was heavily redacted in parts, but the information that was visible made him stop breathing. Arthur J. Pendleton. Captain, U.S. Army, retired, EOD, explosive ordnance disposal. Miller's eyes scanned the commendations, his mind reeling. Bronze Star, 2 Purple Hearts, a presidential unit citation for actions during a deployment he'd never spoken of. He'd led a bomb disposal unit for 20 years. He hadn't just dealt with explosives. He had been one of the foremost experts in the country on improvised devices. The man knew exactly how to make things go boom, and more importantly, he knew exactly how to make them almost go boom. He knew precisely what an open propane valve would and wouldn't do in a chlorinated pool. It wasn't an act of madness. It was a calculation, a demonstration. Miller scrolled down, past the commendations, past the distinguished service record, to the personal information section. The file was mostly boilerplate, but one entry had been updated just 3 months prior. It was a notification from the Department of Veterans Affairs. He leaned closer to the screen, his heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against his ribs. He read the single, devastating line of text. Next of kin. Updated. Subject's wife, Eleanor Pendleton. Deceased. Miller leaned back in his chair, the squeak of the springs loud in the sudden silence of his office. He looked through the blinds towards the interrogation room where Arthur sat, perfectly calm, perfectly still. He finally understood. Arthur Pendleton hadn't just thrown a gas cylinder into the pool. He had sent a message. And Frank Miller was now the only person in the world who could decipher it. Karen Thompson did not sleep. She spent the night fueled by a potent cocktail of indignation and decaf espresso, pacing the beige confines of her immaculate living room. The police had been frustratingly tight-lipped, treating her like a nuisance rather than the star victim of a major criminal event. By dawn, she had concluded that the system was broken, and she was the only one with the moral clarity to fix it. Her first call was to Deborah, who listened with the rapt attention of a true connoisseur of neighborhood drama. They let me go home with a pamphlet on victim services. "Deb," Karen said, her voice a low, theatrical whisper into her phone. "A pamphlet. The man tried to blow me to kingdom come, and I get a trifold brochure." "It's an outrage," Deborah's voice crackled back. "Have you called the HOA? Bill Henderson on the board owes you a favor after you forgot to report his unapproved satellite dish." "The HOA is small potatoes," Karen declared, pausing to admire her reflection in the dark screen of her television. "This is bigger. This is about community safety. This is about sending a message." An hour later, she was on the phone with a junior reporter from Channel 8 News named Brenda, who smelled a juicy human interest story. Karen laid it on thick, her voice cracking with emotion as she recounted her harrowing ordeal. She carefully omitted her own behavior at the pool, painting herself as a gentle soul seeking tranquility, only to be met with unprovoked explosive rage. "He's a veteran, you know," Karen added, a masterstroke of calculated implication. "It's just terrifying. You never know when one of them will snap. The things they're trained to do, I'm just lucky to be alive," Brenda ate it up. They arranged for an on-camera interview at the now-closed pool for that afternoon. Karen's war was no longer just with Arthur Pendleton. It was with the world's indifference. At the station, Sergeant Miller walked back to the interrogation room, the ghost of Arthur's service record open on his office computer. He felt a profound sense of trespassing as he opened the door. Arthur was sitting in the exact same position, as if he hadn't moved a muscle in hours. Miller sat down, forgoing the official interrogation posture. He just sat like a man having a conversation. "EOD," Miller said quietly. "A long time ago, when I was a rookie, you gave a guest lecture at the academy on IEDs in urban environments. You talked about the psychology of it, how it's not always about the blast. Sometimes it's about the fear." Arthur's gaze shifted from the wall to Miller's face. A flicker of something, recognition, perhaps memory, crossed his features. "You remember that?" Arthur asked, his voice raspy. "I remember you said the most dangerous bomb is the one that makes people forget their humanity," Miller replied. "Arthur, I saw the update in your file. Eleanor, I'm truly sorry for your loss." For the first time, a crack appeared in the old man's stoic facade. His jaw tightened, and his pale eyes seemed to mist over. He swallowed hard. "The pool. That was our spot," Arthur said, his voice barely audible. "After her first chemo session, the doctors said she needed gentle exercise. We'd go every morning when no one was there. She'd float just like that woman was. And I'd read to her. We had one good summer before she got too weak. That was our last good summer." He paused, collecting himself. "After she was gone, I kept going. It was the only place I could still feel her. I could sit there, and if I closed my eyes, I could almost hear her laughing at the parts of the book she liked. It was quiet. It was peace." His eyes hardened again. And then she came. Every day, louder and louder, shouting into her phone, berating children, sucking all the air out of the world. It was like she was erasing the memory of my wife with her noise. I asked her once, politely, to keep her voice down. She threatened to call security and have me removed for harassment. The pieces clicked into place for Miller. It wasn't madness. It was grief, cornered and lashing out. "The valve being open, Arthur. You knew it wouldn't explode," Miller stated, not as a question, but as a fact. "Propane is heavier than air. Venting into water, it would mostly dissolve or be carried away in the currents from the filter jets. The surface area for ignition would be minimal, and there was no ignition source. It was a chemical impossibility," Arthur recited, the old EOD captain speaking through the grieving husband. "It was never a bomb, Sergeant. It was a demonstration, a lesson in consequences. I wanted to give her a moment of honest primal fear, to show her what happens when you push something too far. I wanted her to be quiet, just for a minute. I wanted to hear my wife's laugh again." The confession was both heartbreaking and terrifyingly lucid. This wasn't a case for a psychiatrist. It was a tragedy. But the law didn't have a category for that. Miller's meeting with Assistant District Attorney Peterson confirmed it. Peterson was young, sharp, and saw the world in black and white paragraphs of the penal code. He paced in front of his window overlooking the courthouse. Radiating ambition. "I've seen the preliminary report, Frank. And the witness statements are all over the place, Peterson said, adjusting his tie. But the facts are solid. The subject, a trained explosives expert, intentionally caused public panic and assaulted a civilian with a dangerous object. The victim is cooperating fully. This is a slam dunk. She's not a victim. She's a professional antagonist, Miller countered, his voice tight with frustration. She was goading him. The man's wife of 50 years died 3 months ago. He's decorated. He's a headline, Peterson cut in, stopping his pacing. Decorated vet snaps, terrorizes suburban pool. The media is already all over it. Channel 8 is running a special report tonight. My boss wants this handled quickly and publicly. We're charging him with assault with a deadly weapon, reckless endangerment, and making terrorist threats. The judge will set bail high. He's a flight risk. A flight risk, Miller scoffed. He's 80 years old. He has nowhere to go. That's for his lawyer to argue, Peterson said dismissively, picking up a file. It's out of my hands. He'll be arraigned tomorrow morning. The next morning, the courtroom was a circus. Karen Thompson was in the front row, flanked by Deborah and 2 other HOA allies, all dressed in somber tones as if attending a funeral. The Channel 8 news crew was in the back, camera aimed and ready. When they brought Arthur in, he looked smaller, diminished in the drab orange jumpsuit. He shuffled to the defendant's table, his eyes downcast. Karen watched him, a look of grim satisfaction on her face. This was justice. This was her moment. The judge, a stern woman named Esposito, read the charges in a monotone drone. Peterson, the ADA, made his case for a high bail, $250,000, citing Arthur's specialized, dangerous skills and the profound terror inflicted upon the community. Karen preened. It was all going perfectly. Does the defense have anything to add before I rule on bail? Judge Esposito asked, looking down at the overwhelmed public defender assigned to Arthur's case. Before the young lawyer could stammer a response, a voice cut through the courtroom from the public gallery. He's lying! She's lying! All of them! Everyone turned. Standing in the third row was the lanky, red-haired teenager from the pool. His name was Leo. He was clutching a skateboard, his face pale with nerves but his eyes blazing with conviction. His friends were next to him, urging him to sit down. Young man, you are out of order. Judge Esposito's voice cracked like a whip. I don't care! Leo shot back, taking a step forward. The bailiff started moving towards him. I was there. My friends were there. That lady, he said, pointing a trembling finger directly at Karen, was a nightmare. She yelled at a mom with a little kid. She called us animals. She treated everyone like dirt. Mr. Pendleton. He was just sitting there reading. He never bothered anyone. She was the one causing a disturbance. He just had enough. A shocked murmur rippled through the courtroom. Karen's face went from smug satisfaction to livid, blotchy red. The Channel 8 camera swiveled from Arthur to the teenager. Peterson, the ADA, was on his feet, objecting furiously. But Judge Esposito held up a hand, silencing the room. She peered down from the bench, her gaze sharp and intelligent, fixed on the terrified, defiant teenager. The predictable open and shut case had just been blown wide open. Son, the judge said, her voice dangerously quiet, you're going to approach the bench, and you're going to tell me exactly what you saw. A hush fell over the courtroom as Leo, skateboard tucked awkwardly under his arm, approached the bench. The bailiff stood close, a silent, intimidating presence. Judge Esposito leaned forward, her glasses perched on the end of her nose, her eyes missing nothing. ADA Peterson looked apoplectic, while Arthur's public defender watched with a newfound glimmer of hope. In the front row, Karen Thompson was vibrating with a silent, murderous rage. State your name for the record, son, Judge Esposito said, her voice calm but commanding. Leo Miller, he said, his voice cracking slightly. Sorry, no relation. He added with a nervous glance at Sergeant Miller, who stood against the wall, his expression unreadable. Just the facts, Mr. Miller, the judge instructed. Tell me what you saw at the pool. Leo took a deep breath. That lady, he began, pointing again at Karen, who flinched as if struck, was on a rampage from the minute she got there. We were just tossing a football, not hurting anyone. She called us animals, Said we were going to crack our heads open and raise her HOA fees? He shifted his weight, gaining confidence as the words came out. Then there was this mom with her little boy in the shallow end. He was just splashing, and Ms. Thompson yelled at her to keep it down because she was trying to de-stress. The mom looked like she was about to cry. Karen shot to her feet. Objection. He's a child. He's a delinquent with a skateboard. He's probably on drugs. Ms. Thompson, you will sit down and be silent, or I will have you removed for contempt, Judge Esposito snapped, her voice dropping an octave. Karen sank back into her seat, her face a thundercloud. Continue, Mr. Miller. Mr. Pendleton, Leo went on, his voice steadier now. He was just there, reading his book. He's always there, always reading. He never says a word to anyone. It felt like she was the one throwing rocks in a quiet pond and he was the quiet pond. When he got up, it wasn't crazy. It was, I don't know, it was like he was just done listening to her. The simple, unvarnished honesty of the teenager's testimony hung in the air, more potent than any legal argument. It painted a picture not of a sudden psychotic break, but of a final, desperate act of protest. Judge Esposito leaned back in her chair, her eyes scanning the faces in the courtroom. She looked at the furious, entitled woman in the front row, the ambitious young prosecutor, and the tired, decorated old man in the orange jumpsuit. Thank you. Mr. Miller, you may take a seat, she said. Leo retreated to the gallery, his friends patting him on the back as the Channel 8 camera zoomed in on his face. The judge turned her attention to ADA Peterson. Mr. Peterson, your entire argument for this exorbitant bail rests on the premise that Mr. Pendleton poses a grave and unpredictable danger to the community. This new testimony suggests the victim in this case may have been a significant provocateur. It also suggests that the community, or at least its younger members, see Mr. Pendleton in a very different light. Your Honor, this is uncorroborated testimony from a minor, Peterson sputtered. And Miss Thompson's is the gospel truth? The judge shot back. I've seen enough. Bail is set at $10,000 with a 10% bond. Furthermore, I am issuing a temporary restraining order. Ms. Karen Thompson is to remain at least 100 yards away from Mr. Arthur Pendleton at all times. A collective gasp went through the courtroom. Karen's jaw dropped. She was being served with a restraining order? It was an absurdity, an inversion of the natural order of things. And Mr. Peterson, the judge added, her eyes like chips of ice. I suggest you do a much more thorough investigation into the events of that day before this case goes any further. Re-interview all the witnesses. I expect a full report on my desk by the end of the week. This court is adjourned. She banged the gavel and the room erupted into chaos. Karen was screaming at Deborah. The reporter from Channel 8 was chasing after Leo. And ADA Peterson was staring at his files as if they had personally betrayed him. Sergeant Miller walked over to Arthur, who looked utterly bewildered by the turn of events. Looks like you've got some fans, Arthur, Miller said with a small smile. Posting the $1,000 bond was a formality. A local Veterans Aid Society, alerted by someone who had seen the commotion at the courthouse, had it covered within the hour. By late afternoon, Arthur Pendleton, dressed in his own clothes again, walked out of the county jail. Sergeant Miller was there to give him a ride home. That kid? Leo, Arthur said, his voice thick with emotion as they drove through the late afternoon traffic. He didn't have to do that? Some people still know the right thing to do, Miller replied. When they pulled into the Oakwood residences, the atmosphere was palpably different. Neighbors who usually scurried into their homes were lingering outside, talking in small groups. As Arthur got out of the car, a few of them nodded at him. The young mother from the pool was there, holding her son's hand. She gave Arthur a shy, hesitant smile. It was the first kindness he'd received from a stranger in months. He walked to his apartment, the door to which felt like the entrance to a tomb. He unlocked it and stepped inside. It was still and silent, filled with the ghosts of a 50-year marriage. The grief, held at bay by the chaos of the last 2 days, came rushing back in. He sank into his favorite armchair, the one Eleanor had always said was lumpy, and the crushing weight of his loneliness settled over him. He had won the battle, but he was still losing the war. Meanwhile, Karen Thompson's carefully orchestrated media campaign had imploded. The 6 o'clock news didn't lead with the story of a heroic woman surviving a terrorist attack. Instead, it led with a close-up of Leo's earnest, nervous face. The headline read, "Teen defends veteran in courtroom shocker. Accuses woman of harassment." The report included clips of Leo's testimony, a shot of Karen's enraged face, and an interview with another resident who, emboldened by the day's events, described Karen as a neighborhood bully. The reporter, Brenda, a ruthless professional, even managed to find a public record of 3 separate HOA complaints filed against Karen for aggressive and disruptive behavior. Karen's image as a pillar of the community was systematically dismantled and set on fire for a viewership of 500,000 people. She watched it from her beige living room, her phone buzzing incessantly with texts from Deborah and other members of her shrinking social circle. The reflection in the dark screen was no longer a conquering hero. It was the face of a pariah. Back in his silent apartment, Arthur sat in the growing darkness, feeling the familiar tendrils of despair creeping in. Then a soft knock came at his door. He ignored it. It came again, more insistent this time. With a weary sigh, he heaved himself out of the chair and opened it. Standing in the hallway were Leo and his 2 friends from the pool. Leo was holding a brown paper bag that smelled of pizza. Hey, Mr. Pendleton," Leo said, shuffling his feet. We figured you might not have had a chance to eat. Or anything." He pushed the bag forward. "It's pepperoni. Hope that's okay." Arthur stared at them, speechless. He looked past the teenagers, down the hallway, and saw other doors slightly ajar, neighbors peeking out. Not with suspicion, but with a newfound, tentative curiosity. "My friends call me Art," he said, his voice rough. He took the bag, the warmth seeping through the paper into his cold hands. For the first time in 3 months, the suffocating silence of his apartment had been broken, not by the noise of anger, but by the sound of an unexpected kindness. The pizza box sat open on the coffee table, a greasy monument to an unexpected truce. For the first time in months, Arthur's apartment didn't feel like a mausoleum. It felt like a living room. Leo and his friends, perched awkwardly on the edges of the furniture, had managed to do what grief counselors and well-meaning relatives could not. They had filled the suffocating silence. They didn't talk about his wife, or the court case, or the gas cylinder. They talked about school, about a notoriously difficult history teacher, about the best way to fix a wobbly skateboard truck. Arthur found himself listening, then asking questions, then, to his own astonishment, offering a piece of advice about leverage he'd learned in an engineering course 60 years prior. When they finally left, promising to check in on him tomorrow, the silence that returned was different. It was no longer an absence. It was just quiet. For Karen Thompson, there was no quiet. Her phone, once a weapon of social dominance, was now a source of torment. The text had shifted from supportive outrage to awkward silence, and finally, to outright condemnation. Deborah had sent a final, curt message. "I think it's best if we don't speak for a while, Karen. My husband is on the HOA board, and this has become very complicated." The complication arrived in her mailbox the next day in a crisp, formal envelope. It was an official notice of a disciplinary hearing with the Oakwood Residences Homeowners Association. The charge: conduct detrimental to the community, resulting in negative media attention and legal entanglement. The primary evidence cited against her was the Channel 8 news report and a signed petition from 27 of her neighbors. Her campaign to have Arthur evicted had boomeranged with spectacular precision. She was now the one facing exile. A week later, Sergeant Miller called Arthur, ADA Peterson. Facing a weak case, public ridicule, and direct pressure from Judge Esposito, had folded. "They're dropping the assault and terrorism charges," Miller said, a deep satisfaction in his voice. "They're offering a plea deal on a misdemeanor disturbing the peace charge. A small fine, no jail time, 6 months of unsupervised probation. You'd be done with it, Art." "I'll take it," Arthur said without hesitation. The fight was over. He had no interest in punishing anyone anymore. He just wanted to read his book. The day the pool reopened was bright and sunny. Arthur walked towards it with a trepidation he hadn't felt since his first day in basic training. He carried his worn paperback and a towel. As he approached the gate, he saw Leo and his friends already there, sitting on the edge of the water, their skateboards parked nearby. They saw him and waved. The young mother with the little boy was in the shallow end, and she smiled at him, a genuine, warm smile. The fear in his chest loosened. He settled into his usual lounge chair, the one with the best view of the deep end where Eleanor had loved to float. He opened his book, and for the first time, the words on the page didn't feel like a distraction from his grief, but a simple pleasure. The sounds around him, the quiet splashing, the low murmur of the teenager's conversation, the distant hum of a lawnmower, weren't noise. They were the soundtrack of a peaceful afternoon. Then she appeared. Karen Thompson walked through the gate like a ghost haunting the scene of her own demise. She was dressed impeccably, but her face was pale and drawn, her eyes hollowed out. She had lost the HOA hearing. She was being forced to sell her unit. This was her last day at Oakwood. She marched directly towards Arthur, a woman with nothing left to lose. The quiet chatter around the pool died down. Leo and his friends stopped talking and watched, ready to stand up if needed. Karen stopped in front of his chair, blocking the sun. "You!" she hissed, her voice a venomous whisper. "You ruined my life." Arthur slowly placed his bookmark in his novel and closed it. He looked up at her, and the anger he had felt that day was gone, replaced by a vast, weary pity. He saw a woman so trapped in her own misery that she had to export it to everyone around her, a woman drowning in a silence far more profound than the one he had ever known. "I didn't do anything to you, Ms. Thompson," he said, his voice even and calm. "Your life is your own, just as my grief is my own. I'm going to sue you," she spat, her words lacking their old conviction, "for defamation, for emotional distress. I'll take everything you have." He didn't flinch. He simply looked at her, his gaze unwavering. "I already lost everything that mattered," he said softly. "There's nothing left for you to take." The simple, tragic truth of his statement struck her silent. It was the one emotional currency she couldn't devalue, the one battle she couldn't win. She had built her world on leverage, on complaints, on intimidation. But standing before her was a man who had no leverage left to give, a man who had already faced the worst the world could offer and had, somehow, survived. Her power was useless here. Defeated, Karen stared at him for a long moment, her mask of fury crumbling to reveal the deep, pathetic emptiness beneath. She looked around at the silent, watching faces of her former neighbors, none of whom would meet her eye. There was no audience for her drama anymore. The show was over. Without another word, she turned and walked away, past the pool, through the gate, and out of their lives forever. The quiet returned. After a moment, the splashing started again. Arthur watched her go, then took a deep breath of the chlorinated air. He looked at the shimmering blue water, and he could almost see Eleanor's smiling face in the reflection of the sun. The memory was still there, a gentle ache in his heart, but it was no longer alone. It was surrounded by the tentative, hopeful sounds of a new community, a new chapter. He opened his book again. A moment later, a large shadow fell over him, followed by a tremendous splash that sent a shower of cool water over his legs and the pages of his novel. Leo had executed a perfect, ungraceful cannonball into the deep end. Arthur looked down at the water spots blurring the ink, then up at the laughing teenager who was now treading water. A slow, genuine smile spread across his face. It was the first time he had truly smiled in months. And in the warm aft,